Hello and welcome to day 4 of the World Series of Poker Main Event 2019. I am Andrew Brokus. I am currently second in chips. We have just made it into the money. We stopped day 3 when we made it into the money. So beginning of day 4, what we're going to see is, well, it didn't actually end up happening at my table, but what I was prepared for and what you often see on day 3 is, once you're in the money, in this case, day 4, but when you're just inside of the money, what tends to happen is there are a lot of short stacked players who folded their way into the money correctly and now are in a gambly mode. Like they're very short. They are just waiting for their best opportunity to invest the last of their chips. A few of them are going to get lucky and double up and potentially run up a stack. A lot of them are going to get eliminated. So what you should anticipate at this stage of the tournament, it depends on the stacks at your table, but since I was coming in on a fresh day, I didn't necessarily know. Well, I mean, I guess I knew what the stacks. Eventually, I had a chance to look at what the stacks were going to be on my table. But you also never know. I mean, you lose one player, and then you can get a short stack move to your table, or your table might break. Generally, the dynamic when you're just inside the money is you've got a lot of short stacks going all in, and what that means, I mean, it's nice for one of the big stacks because you have a lot of opportunities to just kind of pick off those short stacks without a lot of risk to yourself. You're not, if you have 200 big blinds and they're jamming for 12, right? I mean, you just have an opportunity to make profitable calls and not really be putting your stack in a lot of jeopardy. I do still want to avoid the tough spots versus other big stacks when I can. One important thing to keep in mind is you're not going to be able to open as light when you have these short stacks at the table. I mentioned this in passing on day 3, but it's even more relevant now that you've got so many short stacks who are potentially looking to gamble. I mean, in some cases correctly and in some cases not, but you've got people who are really itching for an opportunity to stick the stack in, and that means that you shouldn't expect, like, if anything, you're going to get fewer pre-flop folds than you would in other situations. So you do need to be a little bit tighter with your opening ranges when you have these players behind you, and you need to be aware of who you're going to be committed to call off against when you do open, and make sure you have a hand that can perform reasonably well against their shoving range given their stack size. And that all ties up with don't end up in spots where you have to fold away equity. You don't want to be opening a hand like 6-5 suited and then have somebody jam 15 big blinds and you have to fold when your equity against them is okay but probably not good enough to call off. You don't want to be in that spot in the first place. Even if folding is correct, you don't want to be putting yourself in the spot where you have to make that fold. A lot of the rest of this should look familiar from previous days. The other thing is, as we get to playing shallower effective stacks, even though my stack personally was large, I have to anticipate playing that often the effective stack will be much shallower because I'll be dealing with my opponent's stack sizes. So when I talk about hands being nutty, there's going to be a lot of cases, if we're looking at a stack to pot ratio of like 3 on the flop, nutty may just mean a good top pair kind of hand. So you need to be thinking about what kind of hand am I going to need to play for stacks, and then you're choosing your hands on earlier streets accordingly. So pre-flop, that means weighting your pre-flop range a little bit more towards big cards, and then also on the flop, when you're thinking about what do I want to semi-bluff with or check raise with or whatever, having the potential to turn top pair and have that be a hand that's good enough to get all in with is going to be an important consideration when you're playing shallower. That said, first thing I did on day 4 was fold ace-jack offsuit. We had a 20x stack open under the gun. I had ace-jack offsuit under the gun 1. I think this could be a reasonable call in late position, like on the button maybe, but I think your edge is thin enough against an under-the-gun opener in the first place that once you factor in the additional risk of 7 players behind you, all of whom can wake up with a hand better than ace-jack offsuit and will a non-trivial amount of the time, I think that takes enough away from your EV that you're better off just folding here. Like, I don't really want to get in 20 big blinds pre-flop against an under-the-gun min-raiser, nor do I really think there's a lot of value in calling here. So even though it's a pretty hand and it's the kind of hand I generally want to be playing when 20 big blinds deep, or 20 big blinds effective, like I have 300 big blinds, but yeah, I mean, this player is 20 big blinds effective, and so ace-jack offsuit is like the sort of hand I want to be playing in that situation, but I don't think it's good enough against his under-the-gun opening range, especially when my own position is poor. So that was the end of the 366 level. We had a couple hands to play after bursting the bubble, and we move on to 488. So I'm down to just 250 big blinds. Hijack, who's playing a 100 big blind stack, opens to 19k. I call with king 10 offsuit out of the big blind. For 100 big blinds, this is not an ideal hand, but I'm getting a pretty good price to peel from the big blind, so I am going to play it. And I'm just going to have to be careful after the flop about just hitting a king or a 10 high flop. I'm not going to have a hand that I want to be building a pot with. However, when I flop top 2 pair, I do have a hand that I want to build a pot with. Check calling and check raising are both pretty viable options. The argument against check raising is just that this is a board where it's pretty tough for you as the big blind to have you're just not supposed to have a lot of a check raising range here because the nuts advantage is really squarely on the pre-flop raiser. Right? Pocket kings, pocket tens, ace king, pocket aces, those are all hands that are likely to be in his range and not yours. So you don't get to do a lot of check raising here because he has most of the strong hands in his range that you don't have. Now, I do happen to have a rare strong hand here with top 2 pair. And however, because I'm going to be doing so much check calling on this board, there's probably a case for also check calling with this hand. Believe it or not, I think check calling with this hand is actually the higher variance option as opposed to just raising it immediately. Raising it immediately is going to result in you winning the pot immediately more often, whereas checking and calling is going to result in you going to showdown more often. And showdown is really what determines your variance most of all. So I think that this is actually the lower variance option is check raising immediately. I also thought that people might be stubborn against me, give it like the people might be expecting me to be a bully with my stack. This is very early in the day, so it's not like I've had a chance to establish an actual reputation yet, but I think a lot of people have the mindset of expecting a player with a lot of chips to be a bully, so I wanted to sort of play into that image here since I actually had a good hand. So I do check raise the flop and he calls, and checking the turn with the intention of check raising is a little out of tempo, right? I was the aggressor on the flop and now I'm checking the turn. What I want to imply here is that I was getting out of line on the flop, that I was just sort of being a bully by check raising the flop. Could be with a draw, could just be with a complete bluff, and now that I'm giving up because we both check. So I want to encourage him to stab at it when check 2. If he does, I'm going to check raise again. If he checks behind, I think there's another opportunity to represent being a bully on the river, which is overbetting. And I think it is actually plausible that, at least from his perception, that I can have a lot of bluffs here. I mean, I'm still sort of playing into the image that I was check raising the flop as a bluff, and some of my bluffs are going to want to follow through on the turn also. But I think a lot of people are going to expect that I'm going to follow through on the turn with a lot of my bigger hands once I check raise the flop. So I think this is a line that looks very suspicious, like check raise flop, check turn, overbet river. I think it has a very like bullyish feel to it, or that's what I was going for anyway. It's also possible that people are just going to fold too much to overbets in the main event, but in general, I've been surprised by some of the hands I've been getting called by. So I limp queen 4 of diamonds in the small blind, big blind checks. I actually don't think there's a real strong case for betting the flop. I mean, exploitively, maybe people are just going to fold too much, but I don't think he really should be folding any better hands than this, except for maybe better queen X. But like ace high and king high should not be folding to a flop bet. And I have a reasonable check calling hand. Like I beat his bluffs with this hand. Queen high is actually good enough to beat bluffs here. I do have backdoor straight and flush draws. On the turn, my hand starts to get a little bit more appealing as a bet. First because there was no bet on the flop. I think my hand is a little stronger in absolute terms, and I am interested in protecting it. I just don't want to. The flip side of protection is the risk of betting into hands that are better than yours. On the flop, I think that's a greater risk than it is on the turn. I also think on the turn, I'm blocking some important hands. I'm blocking deuce 4, 6-4, 7-4. I'm blocking a bunch of his straight draws, and I can represent a straight on the river. Like I'm going to have a good blocker if the river comes a deuce or a 6. I'm going to have a good blocker to a straight, so I can anticipate some profitable bluffs on the river. But it didn't come to that because he just folded to my turn bet. Under the gun one opens 17k. I call ace queen offsuit in the cutoff, and the big blind calls. I I picked up a little bit of a tell here from the big blind. When he looked at the flop, he did this sort of like hard blink and then checked, which I found a little suspicious, and it suggested to me that he liked his hand. So when the pre-flop raiser checked to me, I mean, this is not really a board where ace-queen is nutty anyway, so I'm not interested in playing a real big pot with ace-queen. I guess it's also worth mentioning the big blind had a lot of chips here. I think the big blind had over 1 million chips. So, I was definitely suspicious of that and was kind of wary of putting money into the pot. So we all checked through. Thankfully, the turn is a really nice brick, and the big blind bets just 20K, which, I mean, I still think that he likes his hand, but I don't think it's nutty with him betting only 20K. I think a lot of people are going to want to bet bigger here if they have two pair or a set or something. So I raised 80K. If he 3-bets me, I would just fold, but I think he's going to have like king queen a lot here, which he did. Unfortunately, he rivered a straight. I don't think there's really anything, like, I don't think I should be doing anything differently on the river. I'm really happy with the turn raise though. I think this is important to say, even though on the flop the plan was kind of pot control, there's a lot of new information on the turn, right? Partly that the turn is a brick, so I don't have to worry as much about the board getting scary for my hand later. And then his bet size is a big part of it. Also, there are probably some rivers like on a brick river. I think I can value bet. I definitely don't want to put more money in the pot with a 10. In fact, I think my opponent probably ought to dunk the river here. I think this is a card I'm going to be checking back so often that he wants to have a dunking range on this river. I opened 16K with 9-3 off in the cutoff. This is one of the most out of line things that I did. In the entire tournament, but this was just, everyone behind me was playing way too tight and straightforward and letting me get away with a lot. The only really kind of tough player behind me was the villain from the previous hand, the big blind in the previous hand, who's in the small blind now, which is like the toughest position for him to get involved in the pot. I just thought I was going to be able to get away with opening any two cards, but I think it's telling how rarely I've done something like this. This is maybe the only time in the whole tournament, or one of, I can't fully remember, but you have not seen me make a lot of any two cards plays. And compared to the frequency with which I hear a lot of players, I mean, I want to say recreational players in particular, refer to thinking that pros are doing things with any two cards. I don't think it's actually happening all that often. Like, this is a very specific situation, and it's a very small pot. Like, this isn't me 3-betting. This isn't me, barreling turn and river. Like, this is just a pre-flop min raise with any two cards. I don't think you're going to see a lot of plays where people have literally any two cards. And if you find yourself saying things like, I thought my opponent could just have anything, or I thought he could have any two cards, honestly, you're just being kind of sloppy and lazy with your hand reading. People very rarely are on any two cards. I opened 16K with 10-9 offsuit under the gun too. Again, like, definitely getting kind of out of line with the opening here, but people are letting me get away with it. And I don't have a lot of super short stacks at this table. I guess I didn't give you all the stack sizes at this table, but I don't have players behind me with like 20 big blinds. People behind me have more like 30 to 50 big blinds, in some cases even more than that, but they don't have stacks where they're just jamming pre-flop, and they all seem to be playing too tight, and in particular, they're not 3-betting very often, so I can get away with opening hands like these that, I mean, I definitely have a strong preference for a fold when I open 10-9 offsuit, but it does have reasonable equity when called. Like, it's not a completely unplayable hand. So I get called by the button, which is the same player that I played the previous pot where he had king queen. He's got 1 million chips. It's really important to recognize that when you're opening this wide, the reason you're doing it is that you expect people to fold too much pre-flop. So when they don't fold pre-flop, you can't expect that you're just going to keep bluffing your way through. It's not you can't just c-bet every single flop when their starting range pre-flop is much stronger than yours. So I'm not really trying to bluff my way through here until we get to the river. Like, I think betting the flop is not good, betting the turn is not good. I think on the river, because I just have 10 high and there's so much that I can't beat and I block flushes, I need to make some kind of bet on the river just to get him off of like king high, queen high, jack high kinds of hands. Or, I mean, if you fold small pairs or whatever, that's fine too, but I'm not even sure I need him to fold those hands to make this bet profitable. This is just too weak of a hand to take to showdown when he's shown so much weakness. Like, I think his pre-flop call is a sign of strength, which is why I'm not bluffing the flop. But then once he checks twice, I think he's shown enough weakness that the very bottom of my range should bet. Then, of course, I'm folding when he raises. I shouldn't say of course. Like, I mean, it would be pretty out of line to 3-bet the river here, but this would not be the worst candidate in the world for it. I do block his flushes, but I didn't do it. And I don't think you should generally be doing this kind of thing in the main event. I limp 6-5 off in the small blind. Big blind checks. Right away, I flop both some nuttiness and some good blockers to his straights. It'd be even better if I had a spade in my hand, but I think this is well worth a bet of 8K. The turn is, first off, he's showing a lot of strength by calling the flop bet. Secondly, I think the turn is decent for his range, which should include some floats on the order of queen 10, queen 9, 10 9, king 9, a lot of hands that 9 improves. I'm also have similar hands in my betting range. I have diamonds in my betting range. He should have diamonds in his floating range. So there's a lot of, that 9 interacts with a lot of hands in both of our ranges, but it doesn't interact with my exact hand. So I don't think it's a good hand for me to continue bluffing. When we both check and the river comes the queen of spades, however, I think I'm again in that spot where my hand is stone bottom of range in terms of showdown value. Like I have 6 high, and I don't need to make him fold very strong hands. So you see I'm betting like barely a quarter of the pot on the river. This is not me representing a flush. This is me just trying to get him off of, maybe he has like backdoor die. There's a variety of ways he could show up here with like ace high. I think like this is kind of a tough river call to make with ace high or king high, which I think are hands that could have peeled the flop. That's the kind of stuff that I'm trying to get him to fold with this river bet. I'm not trying to get him to fold any sort of decent pair. I guess he maybe folds like a pair of deuces or a pair of threes. There's a chance he folds those hands. He probably shouldn't for a bet this small, but there's a chance that he does. That's the kind of stuff that I'm targeting here. I'm targeting the bottom of his range, which generally should be the case when you make a very small bluff. And the hand to do that with is the hand that's the very bottom of your own range. Open 16K with 8-7 offsuit in the hijack, yet another slightly out of line raise. This is against, not only do I have a lot of tighter players behind me, but the big blind in particular was a very tight player who was not adequately defending his big blind, was overfolding, which is part of the reason why I'm raising him with stuff with 9-3 offsuit. Flop an open-ended straight draw, so I'm definitely c-betting this. I want to be c-betting a fair bit in this spot anyway, just because even though he is under defending his big blind, I still think he's calling, I think he's also going to overfold to flop bets. Even though his pre-flop range is stronger than it should be, I think he's not going to have a lot of coordination when low cards flop, and I think he's not going to adequately defend with a hand like king queen offsuit, which he probably should be calling a bet with on this flop, but I think he's not going to. And so even though his pre-flop range is stronger than it should be, I still think bluffing the flop, at least bluffing low card flops kind of aggressively, is going to be profitable, even if I didn't have an open-ended straight draw. Certainly when I have an open-ended straight draw, I want to be betting. So once again, I'm trying to get away with being out of line. Someone in particular, the one player that I've identified as being like a good player behind me, does something about it and squeezes. I think it's a pretty nice spot for him to squeeze. I don't think he needs a very good hand to do it. I do think he has a better hand than 8-5 suited. I thought about calling anyway because against a wider range, my equity is not terrible. I decided not to get into a pissing contest here and just folded. I really don't think calling would be the most unreasonable thing in the world here, but I decided I would find another opportunity to go to war with him. Open king 10 offsuit under the gun 1, called by cutoff and button. Button is the, maybe he's not. Never mind that. I don't think the button was the good player from the previous hand. I flopped top pair with a not very good kicker, so this is not a real nutty hand. I think these players are deep enough that I'm not just looking to stack off with this hand. I'm going to be checking a lot in this spot in general, as I've indicated, because I'm opening so wide pre-flop. I'm not going to be c-betting real aggressively when I am called. So I'm going to be doing a fair bit of check folding on this board. This is going to be a pretty good hand. This is a 2-street value hand. This is not a hand where I can bet 3 streets and expect to get called down by worse. And if I'm only going to bet 2 streets, I don't think the flop needs to be one of those streets. I'm not really protecting against anything by betting the flop, except, even ace high may not fold the flop. I'm certainly not causing anyone to fold a flush draw by betting the flop. So I'm not gaining very much from their folds. And in terms of the range of hands that's going to call me, I think I'm going to be in better shape if the action goes check, bet, bet, than if I come right out of the gate betting. There's really not a lot of turn cards that I'm concerned about here. So yeah, I go through with that plan. I go for value on the turn and river and end up getting folded on the river. Open 16K with queen jack offsuit in the low jack. Called this time by small blind and big blind. I don't have a lot of nuttiness on this board. Even though I have a diamond in my hand, it's not a very nutty diamond, especially for a three-way pot. If a fourth diamond comes, I'm not going to feel great about holding the jack. And as you can see, I do peel one small bet on the turn, but when he bets again on the river, I just fold, even though I'm getting a good price. It's actually not important that I have the jack of diamonds. Well, I guess it is because there's 5 diamonds on the board. In theory, he could be betting to get me off of a chop, but I think the size of his bet is not really consistent with that. And the fact that he bet the turn makes it a lot more likely that he has a good diamond. I don't think calling the river would be totally unreasonable here, and against the better player, you probably should. But I think a lot of recreational players, you just aren't going to see the bluffs here to warrant making this call. I don't think you scoop the pot there very often. I open ace king offsuit on the button and get just called by the big blind. Even though I'm not nutty on this flop, I do have a quite good hand on this flop. It's very unlikely he has a better hand than ace king. My hand is in need of protection. It's good enough to call a check raise if it comes to that. So I am going to c-bet the flop. And I mean, this is part of the value of c-betting the flop is especially when your bet is small, you're actually going to get called by hands that you're ahead of. When I bet 12K and he calls, I'm not thinking, oh crap, I'm in trouble, I don't have a pair. I mean, I still think there's a pretty good chance I have the best hand. The flop is kind of a combination value and protection bet. And you want that bet to be small because, the smaller you bet, the wider his calling range. And the hands that you do want to make him fold, I would like him to fold 9-7 of hearts, right? Just like a hand that has 25% equity against me. And I don't need a large bet to accomplish that. He's going to fold 9-7 of hearts for 12K. So, I mean, that's part of why this bet is so small. And I have a lot of hands in my range that look like this. A lot of hands that are probably good, but don't really want to play large pots. And that's what you're accomplishing with the small c-bet. And then you can just take it to showdown and you can beat hands like king high. Open pocket 3s under the gun 1, called by the big blind. This is not a flop where I'm going to feel great about it if the bet gets called, but it is I can be in okay shape. I mean, this is actually pretty similar to the previous hand in that, I'm going to be in okay shape when a bet is called, enough that I can go to showdown and win sometimes, and I really, really want the fold equity that comes from betting. Small blind limps, I just check 8-4 offsuit in position. He bets 8K. I already don't feel good about it because this board is so coordinated. Bottom pair is a lot weaker on this board than it is on some blind versus blind, but I think getting 4-1, especially since I have a heart in my hand also, I can't fold this yet, but I already don't have a good feeling about it. My feeling only gets worse when he checks a 9 turn. I think a lot of his bluffs would want to follow through on that turn, so I think it's quite unlikely that I have the best hand now. And when the river is the queen of hearts, it's almost impossible for me to have the best hand. So many of his semi-bluffs have got, if I wasn't already behind on the flop, on this run out, it's almost impossible. I'm losing to a 9, I'm losing to a queen, I'm losing to a jack. So I think I mean, this is really the bottom of my range also. I don't really have many worse hands that would have peeled the flop and then still be nothing on the river. I mean, it's hard for me to have nothing when the board runs out this way. So I think you have to recognize this is the bottom of your range. You have a flush blocker, and I think you have to bluff something here. He actually tanked a while before he called with king 6, which I think is a hand he should definitely be calling with. I mean, I can be value betting king, so he has an important blocker. But I think if he has something slightly worse, if he has a queen or a 10 or a 9, I think I am getting folds from those hands, which is why you want to make this bet. Open 16K with ace-jack offsuit under the gun, called by the small blind. Even though I have a gut shot here, it's not nutty because there's already a flush on the board. So without a diamond in my hand, I'm not really looking to grow the pot. Thankfully, I river a miracle straight, and it is strong enough to raise for value on the river. I mean, it's going to be a fold to a 3-bet, but he can have a lot worse than a flush. And in fact, given that he didn't bet the turn, it's kind of unlikely that he has a flush. So like you can't get so worried about the fact that there's a flush on the board that you're afraid to try to play a straight for value. I mean, a straight is still a very strong hand given how little action has occurred so far. I mean, it would definitely be better if you had a diamond in your hand to block flushes, but I mean, it's just a clear raise for value, and you just fold if you get 3-bet, but you're not, I mean, so like who 3-bet bluffs here? You know, it's so unlikely that you're going to see a 3-bet bluff here. I don't think you really have to worry about like opening yourself up to bluffs, and you're going to be ahead more often than you're behind when you get action on this raise. Under the gun one opens 20K versus a weak big blind, and I 3-bet him to 60K. This was one of the more competent seeming players at the table. I think he had a stack of about 400K, so like I definitely have room to fold if under the gun one shoves, but I think this is a raise that's going to put a decent amount of pressure on him, and I think he could be opening wide in this spot given who's in the big blind. It's a player that I've also been bullying a lot. To my surprise, the big blind actually just shipped it with king queen off, which is actually, I mean, given that I have king 10 here, it's pretty reasonable on his part. I just didn't think he had it in him to do that. And I told him, like, I felt bad for him here, not only because I bad beat him, but because he made, I think, a very ballsy and quite possibly correct shove with king queen in a spot where I wouldn't have thought he would do it. And I mean, I don't know if he was just getting desperate and he saw king queen and went with it, or if he analyzed this in a more sophisticated way and thought that I could be light here on my 3-bet, you know, light enough, because he doesn't have fold equity. Like I'm not folding anything. If I make it 60 and he jams for 192, like I'm never folding anything. But it's not unreasonable for him to think that king queen could have decent equity against my 3-betting range, and there is a good amount of dead money in the pot. I mean, assuming he gets under the gun one to fold, which he often will, you know, he doesn't even need 50% equity to get it in here. So I think it's actually a pretty good shove from him with king queen, and I kind of felt bad for him that he got punished for that. Cutoff opens 21K. I call ace-9 offsuit on the button. I think it's okay to make folds like this. 3-betting is not terrible either, but I do think ace-9 should be in pretty good shape against the cutoff opening range. However, I have no coordination with this flop, and even though his bet is really tiny, I still fold. I think I'm going to have enough hands to peel, like between my pairs and my hands that are going to have backdoor draws. I mean, even just with one Broadway card on the board, all of my king, queen, king 10, queen 10, even king 9, ace 10. There's so many ways that I can have backdoor straight draws, and a lot of my peeling range here is going to be suited where I'm going to have backdoor flush draws. I don't know that I need to defend with hands that don't have either. This hand just has no nuttiness, and I think even though I want to be calling pretty wide when he only bets like a fifth of the pot, I don't want to be calling quite this wide. I think most of the other hands in my range are going to be better calling candidates than this. I'm still supposed to have some kind of folding range when he bets small, and I think this is the sort of hand that belongs in that folding range. I mean, in general, the way you should make these decisions, I think, is not just to think about your particular hand or, you know, just try to say, well, I'm not supposed to fold a lot when he bets small. That's true, and you should consider that you should be calling a lot more often than folding, but then the next step of that is to look at your entire range and recognize that you are still supposed to have a folding range. So it's not enough to just say, like, I should be calling 80% of the time here, right? You still need to find the 20% of hands that are folding or the 15% of hands that are folding, and if it's not this, what would it be? You know, what would your folds be if not this hand? So now we're at 5-10-10. I open to 20 with 9-5 suited in the hijack. Get called by the same weak big blind that I've referenced a few times before. Once again, I flop a draw and a low card board where I'm expecting him to do more than his share of folding. So I bet. I open 20K with 9-8 of clubs under the gun. Under the gun 2, who's playing $1 million, raises to 60K. And so this again is that the player who I've tangled with a couple of times, and I'm not thrilled to be calling 9/8 suited out of position, but it is a hand that is going to have some nuttiness when we're 100 big blinds deep, and I think he's capable enough of 3-betting me later. Has 3-bet me a couple of times now that it's not that I'm trying to like punish him or teach him a lesson or anything like that. I just think his 3-betting range is wide enough that 9/8 suited is going to have good enough equity against it to call, or good enough playability against it to call. This is an interesting flop. I don't have nuttiness here, right? This, because he's the pre-flop 3-better. I mean, it's not impossible that I would just flat some ace king here. Like I might not just 4-bet get in a million chips with ace king when I'm under the gun versus under the gun too. So it's not that I can't have ace king, but I mean, he definitely has 16 combinations of ace king in his range. So even if he doesn't have a nuts advantage, like 9/8 is not a hand I'm necessarily looking to play for stacks. I'm going to be worried about it if he starts betting really large. Frankly, I think I was probably a little too wimpy about it when I don't think the flop is a good check raise, because not only can he have ace king, but he can have a lot of like draws to better straights. Once the turn is a blank and he bets small again, I think I probably do actually want to raise my hand. I think he has draws in his range that are going to call off. He also has stuff like sets and 2-pair in his range that I would like to either call or fold, but letting them see a free river is the least good option. So I think I actually missed a raise here on the turn because I was so worried about the prospect of ace king. And I think as I've mentioned other places where I thought I did this well, of being willing to make thin value raises, especially when my opponents were giving sizing tells that could make me feel a little more confident in my hand, and had even done it against this player actually with the ace queen versus the king queen from earlier in the day. I think here I missed an opportunity to do the same thing. Admittedly, it is a little harder to do that from out of position, but I think I should probably be raising to like 250 or something on the turn, and then this river I can probably even value bet. Well, although I guess at that point, I mean a value bet is just a shove on the river. Yeah, maybe this is kind of reasonable. I mean, I think it is sort of tricky to check raise here, and then if you get flatted, I think like rivers are pretty tough to play. Like certainly board pairing rivers are really nasty. I think you kind of just have to check fold those, and but even like a blank river like this, I feel like it's kind of hard to bet less than all in when you only have a pot size bet left in the stacks. But betting less than all in and then getting shoved on sucks. It's just I think he's gonna feel like it's because it's gonna be such a leveraged check raise. I think he's gonna feel the threat of stacks when you raise, and that's gonna make it harder for you to get called by worse. I mean, maybe there's still a case for like check raise checking. I don't know. I the more I think about it, I still think raising the turn is probably correct, but I feel a little better about not doing it when I think about what the stack situation is going to be on the river. Small blind limps. I check 4s in the big blind. This would not be the worst raise in the world. He does actually have a stack that he can limp jam though, and that's pretty bad when I have 4s. You end up folding to hands like ace king that you've real good equity against, and I don't think I want to limp call off. I also think just like open shoving here isn't great, because even though 4s has good equity against a wide range, I think his limp call range is going to be pretty pocket pair heavy. Like when he does call off 34 big blinds, you are like 4s is not really the hand you want to have. Like ace king would be a much more reasonable, or not even ace king, like I don't know, ace jack or something would be a much more reasonable like jam. I think ace king strong enough that you want to raise call off, but maybe a slightly weaker ace 10 or ace 9, something that's like pretty good, is going to be resilient even against a wide range, but doesn't really want to induce action by just raising and getting peeled. I think with 4s, especially in the main event, you're a lot better off just keeping the pot small. Real nasty flop for my hand, and I just fold immediately, especially his bet is not tiny. Open 20K with 7-6 off in the cutoff. The same player who's been nettling me for a while, and he makes a very large 3-bet here, which I probably would have peeled. Maybe not. 7-6 off is a pretty bad hand. But I mean, I think in general he should be sizing his 3-bet like this. Like I'm I want to be calling him wide, and he's correctly preventing me from doing that. I think with the big 3-bet, which is good. I think this is good sizing on his part. I mean, it wouldn't really be a close decision for me. I think with 7-6 off, even with a smaller size, but he should be trying to discourage me from peeling with stuff like King Jack offsuit or something. I opened 25K with Ace Jack off under the gun, low jack, and small blind call. I don't want to be c-betting a lot. I've emphasized that quite often. So it checks around to low jack. He bets 25K. The small blind calls. Yeah, you're getting 6-1 at this point. There's an outside chance ace jack is good. There's a reasonable chance that hitting an ace or a jack will give you the best hand. Backdoor straight draw. I don't think calling would be the most unreasonable thing in the world. If it had been heads up with the low jack, I would definitely call. The extra player in the pot, I mean, I think sometimes people trick themselves with this because they think, oh, another player in the pot means I'm getting better odds. Yeah, but it also means your chances of winning the pot are substantially reduced. Like, there's a much less good chance that you're going to win with ace high. There's a reduced chance that you're going to win by hitting a jack. There's just a lot that, I mean, it's going to be harder for you to bluff if the board runs out in a way that you want to do that. Overall, you'd be better off not having this player in the pot. Like, his equity in the pot is worth more than the 25K that he's contributing, so you'd rather not have him in there. You should be folding more often when the small blind calls here than when he doesn't. Under the gun 2 opens 26K. I make it 100 with aces in the big blind. You notice my 3-bet sizing is a little larger when I'm out of position. 10-4-3 rainbow, I think, is a good one to check. I do want to be doing a decent amount of checking in this spot, like not with aces, but just in general. Like when he calls this 3-bet, I don't think you can just bet any 2 cards on the flop. His range for peeling this 3-bet should be strong enough that you can't just fire here with the bottom of your 3-betting range, or with hands that don't have any kind of nuttiness here. Like 9-8 suited without a backdoor flush draw, I don't think is a good bet on this flop. So I'm going to have some check folds, and aces is I mean, part of the case for checking aces here is that I think when I have aces, I'm going to get too many folds, even though I'm saying like I don't want to bluff other hands. It's just he does have a lot of whiffs here, and I block. I mean, so some of the hands that are not folding on this flop is stuff like ace queen or ace jack, I think is probably not folding into a bet, or like any ace x with a backdoor flush draw, stuff like ace 5 and ace deuce. And so I do block a decent amount of his continuing range. Like having aces, you're getting more folds than when you have 9-8 suited. I also think of the hands that are folding, aces really doesn't benefit much from making them fold. If he folds something like king queen or king jack, it's pretty bad for me compared to letting him turn a draw or letting him turn top pair and then be willing to put some money in the pot. And it's important that when I say turn a draw, like it's not great if he turns an open-ended straight draw or even if he turns a gut shot, but my ace blocks him from making a lot of those straights. So if he does have king queen and the turn is a jack, he only has 6 outs instead of 8, and that's a pretty big deal. So I think giving him a chance to improve to a second best hand, because that's so plausible here and because my hand really is not worried about protection, I think this is a good check. The 4 is a real bad card, not in the sense that I'm worried about him having trips, but just because it doesn't improve any of the portion of his range that I was hoping to improve. And the fact that he checks back the flop makes it a lot less likely that he has a dominated pair. So I check again. Check raising here is an option. But I thought that a lot of his hands that were going to call a check raise are going to value bet again on the river anyway, so I decided to give him that opportunity. I have no idea. I had to show my hand first, so I have no idea whether I missed any value here. I think there's a fair chance he just didn't have anything. I opened 25K with king 8 off in the cutoff, called by the small blind. Important to recognize small blind's calling range should be pretty strong here. My opening range is definitely on the wide side if I have king 8 offsuit in the cutoff, so this is not a spot where I have a range advantage that just entitles me to fire at blank flops like this. So we both check, and then when I turn the 8, that's good news. He bets 40. There's a case for raising. You have a hand that is likely good, but also a hand that is going to benefit from protection. He can have straight draws. He can have overcards to the 8. A hand like 10-9 has very good equity against you. Not that he's necessarily folding 10-9, but you are. Well, I guess when I say it has very good equity, like I mean, you're ahead of 10-9, and it's going to call a raise. Maybe that's the way to put it. Your money is going to go in better against 10-9 now than it is on the river, as evidenced by the fact that, the jack gets there on the river. He bets 110K. This is actually a pretty tough decision on whether to call. The spade in my hand is pretty relevant because, there are flushes that get there. The real question is, like, how wide is he betting the turn? When he bets the river, I just have a bluff catcher. I don't think he's value betting worse. The king of spades should be a pretty relevant blocker. The 8 is a little bit of a relevant blocker in blocking like pocket eights. But I think a lot of people are not properly prepared for this river. And what I mean by that is their turn bluffing range. Like, essentially, they're on the turn, they have like strong hands that they're value betting, which I don't think he's betting 110K on the river with a worse 8 than mine. Like, I do think he could value bet a worse 8, but I think it's going to be for a smaller size. If he bets like 60K, I think he could have a hand like 10-8 or 9-8. But when he bets 110K, I don't think he has a worse 8. So, his turn betting range includes good made hands, some of which I'm ahead of, many of which I'm not. And then it also includes, it should include a fair number of bluffs. Those bluffs should be straight draws, flush draws, and then also some hands that are not 10-9 or spade draws. And the reason for that is that sometimes the river is the jack of spades. And when the river is the jack of spades, he wants to be able, it would be in his interest to be able to bluff this river card. But this river card is so good for his turn betting range that I think a lot of people just end up under bluffing here. So even though I have a couple of like decent blockers in my hand, it's still not that high value of a river call in theory. And I think in practice, a lot of people don't construct their turn ranges in a way that enable them to have bluffs on this river. And there's probably I combine that with the fact that a lot of people just aren't bluffing when they bet 110K on the river in the main event. I think there's probably a pretty good case for folding the river here. And I did lose to 10-9. I open with Ace of Heart 9 for 25K under the gun, and I get called by 5 players. Not great, but I do get just about the best possible flop. Not the best possible, but I get, a well above average flop with top pair and a backdoor nut flush draw. My c-bet sizing in general is going to be smaller in multi-way pots. You may have noticed that. This spot in particular, I think, is good for a small c-bet size, and getting to find out what happens behind me. Like, it's not like I'm just making a decision of, I'm just betting and getting it in with ace-9 or whatever. I mean, it depends on what happens. Sometimes you bet and the action goes raise 3-bet, or it goes call, raise, call. I mean, a lot of things can happen when there's 6 players in the pot. So betting small kind of, you do get a lot of the folds that you want. I want to get hands like king, queen of spades to fold. That's a big part of the value of this bet. So, betting gets you that protection value, and it also but betting small is enough to get those folds. And it also limits your exposure to where if the action does go crazy behind you, you're not overly committed to this pot. But if what ends up happening is, here it just folds around to the big blind and he jams, you have a hand that you want to call off with. I'm getting like 2-1 almost. And, I could be good. He could have a worse 9. He could have 8-7. He could have a hand like Jack 8 of hearts, which is, especially with the 8 of hearts being in my hand, I think I'm probably a little bit of a favorite here, but I'm certainly have more than 33% equity that I want to call off against him. So unfortunate that I lost this pot, but I think it was a lucky flop, but I think getting this sizing right is pretty important. I think a lot of people struggle. I think a lot of people have the idea that they should bet bigger in multi-way pots, and I'm not really sure what the logic is behind that. I think there's just sort of a generic, like, I'm less comfortable, and so I'll bet bigger and hope everybody goes away. But the truth is, each individual person should be going away for a cheaper price in a 5-way pot. When you bet a third of the pot heads up, the player in position knows that if they call, they're going to see the turn in position. In a 6-way pot, the same player holding the same hand, facing a bet of the same size, is going to have to fold more often because he doesn't just have to worry about you. He still has to worry about those 4 other people in the pot also. So part of what you're doing with the small bet sizing is you're like leveraging the stacks of the players behind you, and you're making it hard, especially for the players who have bad relative position. You don't need to make as large of a bet in order to present them with difficult decisions with the portion of their range that's going to be marginal, like the portion of their range that is not just snap continuing on this board. And the ace of hearts is also a really important blocker here. In terms of getting folds, when you block the nut flush draw, it's a lot less likely that other people are going to be continuing in the pot. And then also, I think people have an idea that because the board is coordinated, they need to make larger bets, and that also is not really true. I don't think there's any hands that are being presented with more difficult decisions when you make a larger bet. I think maybe 10 Jack is the only exception to that, or 10-8. Just the gut shots are maybe the only hands that might fold for 100K and not for 50K. But I think overall that's not a trade-off that's worth making, because the downside of making a larger bet is that when you are behind here, you're pretty frequently well behind. You're behind a bigger pair, you're behind a set, you're behind 2 pair. The kinds of hands that have you beat, you really don't want to be putting more money in the pot than you have to. Under the gun 1 opens 25K. I 3-bet 75K with ace king in the low jack, and I actually folded to this shove. And this is the same player that I previously 3-bet with king 10, and that hand did go to showdown, so there's that. But it was a totally different player in the big blind now, and I think the player understood why I 3-bet him with king 10 in the first place. I don't think his takeaway from that was just, this guy's crazy, he'll 3-bet with anything. I think he understood that I 3-bet him light because of who was in the big blind in that previous example. So this is a very different situation with not having that player in the big blind anymore. I do think he's going to have ace king a lot here. I don't think he ever has, the critical question is, does he ever have ace queen? I kind of doubt it. And if he doesn't have ace queen, I don't think this is a good call. If his range is just pocket pairs and ace king, chip wise, I'm a favorite, but it's a pretty big gamble for 675K. And even though it has positive chip EV, you don't want to take these kinds of gambles in the main event where it's like a quarter of my stack and I already have a huge stack, so adding another, of course it would be nice to get another 600,000 chips, but gaining 600,000 chips is not worth nearly as much to me as, losing 600,000 chips would hurt me. So I did decide to fold here. That does mean that I'm going to be exploitable by him 4-bet jamming. I don't think, but there's other reasons why he doesn't want to 4-bet jam 675K. Even if he knows that I'm going to overfold here a little bit, the consequences of jamming, a bad hand when he does get called are so bad that I don't think you're going to see people really taking bad advantage of these shoves. And I think you really just have to consider not just the chips that are involved, but the value of your stack if you call and win versus the value of your stack if you call and lose. And I didn't like the way that value proposition shook out. Seems like a good place to let off for this part, and I think we should be able to get through the rest of day 4 in the next part.